Thank you very much. And can I begin by acknowledging that we meet on the land of the Gadigal. This is Aboriginal land, always has been, and I pay my respects to the elders past and present. The 2015 election is going to be critical for public education. It comes at a crucial time for the global debate on education and for the debate in Australia. After decades of neglect of public education, not just stagnant funding for public schools, in the case of TAFE, declining funding, and not just a lack of genuine political leadership to define a way forward for public education, and not just the growing leaching of funds out of public education into private providers and private schools, but a growing hostility to the very notion of a system of public education delivering quality outcomes for every Australian. That hostility has now been given a veneer of respectability. It's a very thin veneer of intellectual respectability, but a lot of intellectual work, quasi-intellectual work, is going into doing so in the form of the global education reform movement. It began with the idea of mass standardised testing, went to the idea of comparing schools on the basis of averaged results in mass standardised testing. It goes to teacher performance pay, and it goes now further to the idea of independent public schools. Can I tell you, friends, that at every single stage the Greens have opposed the very beginnings of the global education reform movement in Australia, and we will continue to do so. We do not believe for 1 minute that education is a commodity. We do not believe for 1 minute that education, whether it is to young people or whether it is vocational education and training, can ever be traded through a market and expect that out the other end will emerge quality outcomes. We do not believe that teachers are production units. We do not believe that schools are businesses. We do not believe that TAFE colleges are businesses. We do not believe that students are clients. We believe that public education at both schools and a TAFE level is an investment in the future that has to be safeguarded, protected and nourished. By ignoring the contribution that a system of public education delivers not just to the wealth of the nation but to social justice outcomes, the global education reform movement has created a platform for a divided society, for a society where the wealthy succeed and the poor and the working class are relegated to second-class outcomes. Labor federally and in New South Wales introduced the virulent New York strain of the global education reform movement. Pyne, and I suspect with some reluctance, Adrian Piccoli in New South Wales, have invented new and more deadly forms of the global education reform movement. Pyne with his independent public schools, which must be resisted at all costs, and Adrian Piccoli with his local schools, local decisions, and with Smart and Skilled, the death sentence for TAFE. Despite the payload of privatisation that the germ has brought to New South Wales, public education continues to thrive. There is a good news story in what teachers and their professionalism continue to deliver for public education and for schools and for our community. Public schools continue to amaze me. Despite the neglect and the abuse and the hostility, they continue to deliver quality outcomes for all Australians. And the campaigning of teachers and the campaigning of their union has produced remarkable outcomes. I note that there's been a civilised and productive conversation between the New South Wales Teachers Federation and a National Party State Minister for Education on professional development and supporting teachers reaching their goals. I support that outcome, remarkable as it is. But more significantly, teacher activism and a union that has been prepared to engage with the community and galvanise their demand for funding that respects the needs of the community has addressed one of the diverse challenges of public schools, and remarkably and delightfully has produced an outcome which says that education funding must achieve outcomes that are equal for all students, not just for those who are very wealthy. Despite Pyne and Abbott having lied appallingly during the state election to the Australian people, they are now taking up the cudgel of being the agents of the private school lobby who fear the convergence of resources that Gonski could bring. And they want to make sure that Gonski is frozen in time so that that convergence stops and the gap between public and non-government education grows. The Greens find that outcome completely unacceptable. Nobody should be prepared to watch funding of non-government schools, not just the wealthiest non-government schools, but the Catholic school system and also the so-called low-fee independent school system eat away at the future of public education. 2 months ago, my party, the Greens, decided enough was enough. We have now moved to a policy position of no public funding for non-government schools in New South Wales. The $1 billion a year of your money and my money that will liberate should go back into public education and close the gap that is being left open by the slow and now to be aborted implementation of the Gonski process. 10,000 new teachers in public education can be purchased with that money. And many of those teachers can be directed towards closing the gap between what the Disability Discrimination Act and the United Nations Charter tells us should be happening for children with special needs and what the reality is. Not because of a lack of teacher commitment, not because of a lack of will, but because of a lack of resources. Too many children who have special needs and additional needs are going without. And that is putting enormous pressure on teachers, it's putting enormous pressure on the education system. It must be solved. It can be solved if we have the courage to stand up to the non-government school lobby and their incredible political power and say that money belongs in public education. Christopher Pyne is delaying the implementation of the additionality that was supposed to go to children with special needs in public education. 2015, nothing. 2016, well, who knows what will happen then. This is not acceptable. We will find the money and we will make sure that money goes into public education. We also recognise the need for sustained refurbishment and maintenance of public schools. No prospective parent of public education should walk through the door of their local public school and be anything but delighted with the quality of buildings and the quality of playgrounds. We believe this can happen. There needs to be a recurrent source of funding. For too long, religious and non-government schools have avoided their requirements, their obligation to pay land tax and council rates. That has gone on for too long. It is time to redirect, to get that money out of those schools and put it into refurbishment of public schools. Despite Gonski and despite the privatisation agenda gaining major footholds in New South Wales, despite Gonski and despite the good work that's been done, the privatisation agenda has gained two major footholds in New South Wales. The first is local schools, local decisions, and the second is smart and skilled. I guess the third is the salary cap. Local schools, local decisions is wrong. It is the wrong kind of autonomy. Since its inception, we've been trying to get Adrian Piccoli, the Education Minister in New South Wales, to admit what the evidence says. The OECD evidence is very, very clear. It says that autonomy of the form that occurs in LSLD, autonomy of the form that talks about turning principals into centre for blame when resources are inadequate to the needs of a public school, does not produce, unsurprisingly, improved educational outcomes. But the sort of autonomy that we should be talking about is liberating the professionalism of teachers, allowing teachers to have control over curriculum and how it's delivered, allowing teachers to have control over testing and how it is used to assess students. The global evidence is clear. That kind of autonomy, the professional kind of autonomy, works. The financial autonomy is a failure. Our key concern is that LSLD is the foot in the door to destroying the commitment that began with Henry Parkes 132 years ago and should be continued for at least another 132 years, the commitment that every classroom has a qualified teacher standing in front of it. We are concerned. Like you, the Greens remain deeply concerned that the next round of negotiations, as foreshadowed in the Commission of Audit report, will see attacks on the staffing formula and attacks on teacher transfer. We believe now, or next year in 2015, the only way to protect it is to put it into legislation. We announce here today that we will be moving legislation in early 2015 to protect the staffing formula, to protect teacher transfer, so that any government that wants to mess with it, that wants to use LSLD as a foot in the door, will have to deal with the New South Wales Upper House. And having been there for 7 years, I wish them the best of luck. We believe as I was told by a man who's now a senior officer of this union, I'm not confused, of this union, as I was told many years ago, the staffing formula, the transfer rights, the commitment to a system of public education is critical. It defines the difference between private schools and public schools. It defines the commitment that is to every child in this nation and in this state. It defines the commitment to our future that every child will receive a quality education. We will not let that be traded off in any school, in order to cover inadequate resources. Friends, you might have already realised, but TAFE is the front line of the attack on public education. If TAFE falls, we all fall. That is why I've spent the best part of the last 2 years, campaigning flat out to stop Smart and Skilled, to stop New South Wales going the same way as Victoria. There is no way that you can argue, as indeed Adrian Piccoli does, that there is any difference between Smart and Skilled and the schemes that were implemented by the same man, I might say, Christopher Eccles, in Victoria. Yes, appropriate to boo and hiss at that point. I do, so I don't see why you shouldn't. That was implemented in Victoria and South Australia. In Victoria, public provision of vocational education and training has fallen to 27%. In Queensland, TAFE has been stripped of its buildings and has to bid against private providers to get back into their own buildings. And in New South Wales, Smart and Skilled, before it even began, has hollowed out TAFE colleges around the state. We are seeing student support being destroyed, students with special needs, students who come from non-English speaking backgrounds, students with educational deficits, students who are seeking to have a second chance in education are having the door slammed on them in the anticipation of the training market. It is killing off critical courses and it is pushing up fees. Smart and Skilled is a recipe for privatisation. It is one administrative decision away from Victoria, Queensland and South Australia. It is one administrative decision away from the total and comprehensive destruction of TAFE. Public funding opened up to private providers inevitably ends up working against working class Australians. It inevitably means that education becomes a commodity and that those who don't go to university end up with low quality skills training that simply prepares them for one job and one job only. There is no way that any person who has any respect for public education should not be full on the campaign to stop TAFE. There are lessons from Victoria, there are lessons from South Australia and Queensland, and those lessons are that we should never let education be traded through a market. How history will read the beginning of the 21st century is a major error by both Labor and the Coalition in ever going anywhere near the idea of privatisation and markets for vocational education and training. Earlier this year, I had the great pleasure of introducing a bill to stop Smart and Skilled, to reduce fees back to where they were in 2010, and to stop the funding to private providers and holding it back at its year 2010 level. I want to at this point thank the TAFE teachers and others in public education community who campaigned hard to achieve at least a symbolic success of getting that legislation through the upper house. I've got to tell you, I have to tell you, there are people in this room who became more intimate with the Shooters and Fishers party than they ever wanted to, myself and Phil included. But that produced, and whatever it takes, comrades, that produced the outcome where the O'Farrell and Baird governments were embarrassed by the passage of that legislation through the New South Wales upper house. That legislation said that the proportionally represented Parliament, the most democratic chamber of Parliament in New South Wales, was saying no to Smart and Skilled, no to the trading of education through a market. Last week, I'm sorry to report, that bill was defeated on party lines in the lower house. I pay tribute to Ryan Park and the Labor Party for recognising this was essential. They had, having supported Smart and Skilled when they were in government, or the incipient versions of Smart and Skilled when they were in government, have recognised the error of their way, and that is good news for all of us. I also pay tribute to the Shooters Party, who uniquely, amongst many political parties in Australia, stood up for what was on their website and voted with us. That is not the end of it. The loss of that bill was just a campaign. It was a campaign that went through travelling around TAFE colleges across New South Wales, meeting with TAFE teachers, doing media, making sure that the community knew that this was the front line of education reform and it has to be turned back. But I announce here today that we will accept that Smart and Skilled will go ahead in 2015. I tell you, for 2016, we are committed to stopping it. But in 2015, it will go ahead if the Baird government is hard to keep up, if the Baird government is re-elected. But you'd think after 7 years in New South Wales politics, I'd be able to do that, wouldn't you? I announce here today our Plan B legislation. Legislation that will put the brakes on Smart and Skilled. Legislation that says enough is enough. Legislation that says that the primary responsibility of every government around Australia and in New South Wales has to be a public sector provider of vocational education and training. That legislation will put the brakes on the amount of money that goes to non-government providers. Non-TAFE providers will be restricted to just 20% of the public budget. 80% of the public budget, the public expenditure on vocational education and training will be held for TAFE, for the public system, for the rights of every person to receive a quality vocational education and training. But we want more than that, because we know that there are corporations that are circling around New South Wales salivating at the prospect of getting their hands on your money and my money. We want to shut the door on any new private provider coming into New South Wales. Our legislation bans a private provider from receiving any public funds for a course for which they have not provided in the past. Our legislation also says that there shall be no public money going to private providers that operate for profit. We cannot allow the vocations of this world, John Dawkins' evil company that is setting out to take over education in Australia, we cannot let it get a foot in the door funded by your money and our money. We will ban any for-profit organisations receiving public funding. It is not a perfect bill, but it is a bill that says we draw a line in the sand until we can marshal the numbers and the forces to turn off Smart and Skilled and to go back to a day where public education is at the lead. Can I say again that we remain committed to the TAFE campaign through this election and beyond. Our legislation will be the next phase in our campaign, but we will continue to work with teachers, with the union and with everybody in the community of goodwill. I don't have time to do the 6 hours and 37 minutes it seems to take me to persuade you that I don't support the 2.5% wage cap. If I did, I would subject you to 6 hours and 25 minutes, but I don't have that time now. So let me suffice it to say that every public sector worker deserves the right to have their pay and their conditions arbitrated before an independent tribunal. That tribunal should never, ever, ever have its hands tied by legislation or by administration. Further, let me say this, the 2.5% can never, ever represent or respect the value of a public education teacher in TAFE or in schools. It cannot respect the complexity of those jobs, the importance of the work that is being done, and the demands of the workload that is being placed on teachers in public education. I finish with this observation. There are countries around the world that have been resistant to the global education reform movement. They continue to recognise that the centrality of a system of public education is critical to the outcomes of every student. They continue to recognise that delivering teachers, that respecting and enhancing teacher professionalism in the classroom, supported by quality teacher professional development, supported by community respect for teachers, is central to those outcomes. And they continue to be prepared to pay the financial price for receiving the benefits of a teacher workforce that is properly respected and properly paid, operating in a system that delivers for all Australians. I finish by saying this. The Greens are committed to making New South Wales and Australia one of those jurisdictions that is known as resistant to the global education reform movement, that nourishes and cherishes its public education, that recognises that teachers are the key to the future and recognises that education is not a commodity, but that education is a social good that can only be provided by a public sector organisation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, John. And we've got a number of questions we'd like to ask you. If I could, Gary. We have about 10 minutes, and we're going to keep very strictly to time. 10 minutes of questions.
John, Gary Dunbier from Wingham Teachers Association. Wingham's on the mid-north coast. Thank you for that very uplifting speech. My question is about the physical working conditions that we as teachers endure and the link to kids' learning conditions. All right, so what we find happening in the 21st century, when we embrace great teaching inspired learning, we find ourselves restricted to classrooms and spaces that are overcrowded, too hot, too cold, too leaky. The conditions aren't commensurate with the needs of kids and teachers these days, particularly when we look at things like technology and special education. So I was pleased to hear that what you said about refurbishment. So specifically, can you expand on that and tell us what you and the Greens will be doing to force the government into taking our physical working conditions into the 21st century? And also, could I just raise the issue of demountables, which in many cases are outrageous, but as problem-ridden as they are, at least they represent a teaching space. And we've got a formula that's 50 years old and outdated. And for example, at my school, we're losing about a dozen students and we're losing 1 to 2 demountables. The absurd thing is that these cost about $100,000 to remove, and then they're placed in some field in Cessnock. So could you expand on your ideas to do something about that?
Thanks, Gary. Look, you're absolutely right. There is no way that we can expect there to be inspired teachers, inspired learning, and operating in conditions that really belong in Dickensian times rather than in the 21st century. The Building the Education Revolution, despite some botched implementation in New South Wales, was a step forward. But it has to be, as the Trotskyists would say, it has to be a continuous revolution. We can't let it sit still and die at this point. There is still too much work to be done. I receive continuous reports of carpet that's been torn up, of classrooms that continue to leak, toilets that are inadequate, teaching spaces that aren't fit for purpose for the 21st century. This is a great time to be talking about this. This is election time. Politicians get really sensitive when you kick them in the sensitive bits. I think we should be out there kicking as hard as we can. I think every school should be saying we need what we need. I am committed to fixing this problem. We've been looking at the issue of unflued gas heaters. I can't say how disappointed I was that a National Party that spent 16 years in opposition saying they would fix the problem of unflued gas heaters got into office, and it was like a typographical error. Suddenly it was like Verity Firth. It was like Adrian Piccoli was channeling Verity Firth. We got the same lame excuses that will not work. It is time to get rid of unflued gas heaters entirely across the entire state. It is time. They're banned in Victorian houses. Why should they be allowed in New South Wales in classrooms? It's time to put real money back into public education classrooms. We've identified one funding source. That may or may not happen. It doesn't matter what the funding source is. We need, first of all, a system of identifying what the maintenance needs are, and secondly, that those maintenance needs are executed rapidly. And it needs to be a revolving system of maintenance. There was, under the days of the Department of Public Works, I don't know if it was always expertly executed, but some blokes would come round and look at what needs to be done, and it would be done on some kind of cycle. That doesn't happen anymore. We need to get back to it. I'll finish by saying this. One of my concerns with LSLD is that far from giving principals some authority over what gets fixed, it will leave principals impotent to find the money to fix the problems of their schools.
Diane Byers, Camden, Campbelltown. John, the benefits of additional funding through Gonski are widely acknowledged and much appreciated by students, parents, teachers and principals. As you all know, 2/3 of the $5 billion in the New South Wales Gonski agreement comes in the 5th and 6th years. The Abbott government to date has refused to commit funding to contribute in those years. This means our students will miss out by $1.2 billion. My question is, between now and the next federal election, what will you and the state branch of your party do to convince the Abbott government to fund the 5th and 6th years of Gonski for New South Wales students?
Thank you for that question. The Abbott government is now the mouthpiece of the private school lobby. Well, it's hardly surprising. And the private school lobby, while publicly supporting Gonski, privately at every turn tried to undermine it. Not because they weren't getting more money themselves, they were, but because what they didn't want to see was public education, public schools receiving funds that would begin to close the gap. And they were prepared to forego, for some of their schools, sizable amounts of money purely to secure for themselves the comparative advantage over public education. I am convinced now that if the Abbott government is doing this for non-government schools, then we need to turn around and make non-government schools responsible. It's one of the reasons why our party made the decision to strip non-government schools of state funding entirely and redirect that to public education. I think that's the debate we need to have. I think we need to go back to a lot of the work that we were doing 3 years ago, before Gonski, where we spent a lot of time pointing out private school extravagance. And it is extravagance. Let's be absolutely realistic here. St Catherine's in the eastern suburbs is about to spend $35 million on a swimming pool and performing arts space. We can build 1.5 brand new high quality public schools for the same amount of money. Sydney Grammar spent more than $37 million on a new assembly hall. They already had one, they needed a second one for some reason. The seats were designed in Sweden because the bottoms of the boys at Sydney Grammar need special moulding. I want the record to show I said that with a straight face. I think there is a serious campaign to be run here, and we will be doing this through the election and beyond, to make it clear that you can't get away with allowing the gap to grow again. And we will be doing everything we can to put that pressure on. In the end, I think that the final answer I want to give you, there's only one way of convincing the Abbott government of anything, and that is voting them out of office.
We've got 2 minutes, so we'll maybe short questions, short answers, John, and we might better get another question in.
Thank you. Good morning, Dr. Kaye. Phil Cook, the Cessnock Teachers Association.
Yes, we've met.
Dr. Kaye, teachers are experiencing increasing workload pressures, many of which can be attributed to politically generated staffing cuts and so-called reforms. For example, cutting hundreds of non-school-based jobs in the department through the local schools' local decisions policy, as the state government has recently done. This simply pushes workload down onto schools. What will your party do to alleviate workload pressure?
Well, we will continue to argue for a reversal of local schools' local decisions, to try and get all political parties to recognise that teachers are educational professionals, but they need support. They need the support, they need curriculum support, they need expert advice, they need the sort of support that came out of the drug and alcohol unit, they need the sort of support that comes from the disability services that were provided centrally. We will be arguing strongly in the next term of Parliament to limit LSLD, local schools, local decisions, and to restore those department services. We will be arguing against the sale of the Bridge Street office. I find it hard to believe I'm sticking up for Bridge Street, but I am. This Bridge Street office must remain because despite some terrible things that have come out of that office, there are some very good and important things that have come out of the New South Wales Department of Education and Communities. This is a government for the many pleasant things about Adrian Piccoli. He has presided over the destruction of the Department of Education Central. And that is not acceptable, and it can be rebuilt, it must be rebuilt. We cannot make it, as happening in TAFE as well, we cannot make it that teachers become administrators, they become developers of curriculum material, they become experts across too wide a range of materials. We are already running a public education system that only survives by exploiting the goodwill of teachers. That cannot continue. We have to have a public education system that allows teachers to develop, to have the space and the time to teach, to talk to each other and to share professional learning. That means a central department that supports the system and takes the pressure off teachers for those functions that are more efficiently done centrally. I finish by saying this: the utter weakness in the whole new rights argument about school autonomy is that they are into efficiency, and yet the most inefficient thing you can possibly do is have the same thought process being repeated across the state in 2,220 public schools. We oppose that. We will work for the restoration of those centralised services.